All right, let's get started with this second pen where we're going to get into some CSS and styling this. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is imagery. All right, so if you were to go back and look at the example, okay, which I just pulled up here, one of the things that you're going to notice is that we've got a background image, all right, and then we also have this image of a boot. The image of the boot is placed in the HTML with an IMG tag. The reason that you don't see the background image in our other one is because background images are used in CSS, and we haven't started our CSS yet. So we could start with fonts and things like that, but if we know that this picture, this background picture, is going to be integral to the layout, then we should probably go ahead and insert that image so that we can start to see how we want colors and things like that to interact with it. In addition, you'll see that the composition of the picture, you know, has this mountain terrain and then there's sky. And so there's this call tag, right? This sort of marketing call to action, if you will, says be good to yourself. And that's something that is a light and sort of exciting call to action that maybe should be in the sky where it can have its own highlighting, right? And so the shoe can then look sort of like it's resting. The shoe actually has uh, like a not a background, a shadow underneath it as part of the image, and so it can almost look like whenever you first come to the page, like it's resting somewhere in the terrain or something, right? And so it doesn't have to be perfect like this. It, you know, if you were to scale it, you see that it changes a little bit, but no matter what, because of the way that the image is, it still is reasonably looking like it's resting on the terrain. So that's not bad. Okay, so that's why we want to go ahead and get that image in there and see how it's going to start to interact with the color of the text, the size of the text, and all of that stuff, right? Okay, so let's come back here and get started with that. The first thing that you'll see is that we've got this picture of the boot. It's gigantic, right? And one of the things that you'll come to realize is that whenever you have an image, the image is always going to show up as big as it actually is. It's going to take up the size that it natively is. And so this is a fairly large image. And there are some different ways that we could go about doing this. We could take this picture and go make a smaller version of it in something like Photoshop. But for right now, we're just going to focus on making this image responsive, right? And so there are a couple of dangers of just making an image responsive in terms of making it scale down from something that's large. And the problem with that is that if somebody goes to look at this, like say on a mobile browser for the first time, like if they're on their phone or something, they may or may not have less bandwidth than, say, a desktop computer that's hooked into a landline. Well, if we load this gigantic image, but really it needs to only be very small, then we're loading tons and tons of data on their end and making them download it unnecessarily. But we're going to get to some of those bigger issues later. Right now, we're just going to talk about the basics of how to scale images up and down. And in order to scale an image up, you need to make sure that the resolution is actually going to support the larger width or the larger size. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to start with this large image, and we are going to just allow this large image to scale down. All right, and that's how it will be quote unquote responsive. And responsive means basically that it responds to the screen dimensions or to the browser width. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how we can first just get that kind of smaller. All right, and to do that, let's look over here at our HTML, and this is the image that we've got. And if we want to take a really brief look, here, let me open this up a little. This is the entire page right here, okay, of HTML. We have a paragraph that is the starter that has an ID of callout, meaning that it's something sort of special. And you'll notice that that's not the H1. If you look down below, the H1 actually has the name of the product. And so that is strategic, so that if a search engine were looking for the product relevancy, right, or if it were looking for a search term, somebody wouldn't search the term, probably they wouldn't search the term be good to yourself. They would search the term Sierra Quest GX3 if that's the name of the boot that they're looking for. And so an H1 would have a better dominance. So anyway, you'll see that there's this call out up here. It's just in a paragraph tag, so it doesn't have as much dominance. But then the next thing that you see in linear order is this image tag. And that's what we need to address. And so one of the things you'll also notice is that, let's take apart this image a little bit. So we have the image tag, the IMG, all right? And then next we have an attribute called source, right? And that tells us where to go find the picture, and it's located somewhere. I put it up on a server somewhere so that you can access it in CodePen. And then the next attribute is alt, or alternative text, okay? And I went ahead and I had put the name of the boots, because that's what the picture is of. It's the name of the boots, so that we know what we're looking at. And then the third attribute that I added here was align. Align is an attribute that I typically don't want you to use. Later, we're going to get to more sophisticated ways of doing positioning with CSS. But for right now, you should know that this is actually a valid piece of markup where I can put it directly into the HTML and say align equals left, right? And then as soon as I make that picture, you might look at this and go, well, it doesn't look like it's a line left to anything. Well, that's because the picture is too big and it's taking up too much space, and it knocks everything else down that comes after it to the next line, to the next block, right? So, but once we make this picture smaller, this align left is going to kick in, and this align left is not part of the CSS. It is in fact part of the HTML. And this align left or align right or align center, however you want to look at it, it has some limitations. It's handy in pushing things around, and it used to be used before CSS was a thing, right? And in just regular old HTML. But it does have some limitations in it. We'll get to some of those later. But later in the semester, this isn't something I'm going to want you to use, but for now it's fine. It's absolutely, truly valid, okay? So let's go ahead and get the image, this main image here, a little bit more in a manageable way. If I pull up my CSS tab right here, I can start adding CSS, and it's going to automatically apply itself to this pen. So the way that I am going to identify it, if you remember back from tutorials, is you're just going to target the IMG tag just like that, okay? And I'm going to put my first curly brace, and then you see that it automatically put a second curly brace for me and closed it. And then I just, here, let's just type that again. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to zoom in here, all right, so you can see a little bit better. I'm going to type IMG and then space. You don't have to have a space, but it's a good practice. And I'm going to put my first opening curly brace, or my left curly brace, and the curly brace is located on your keyboard above the double quote mark, and you're going to have to hold down the shift key to get it. So make sure you don't put this. That's a bracket. So you want to put the brace, curly brace, okay? And so when I do that, it automatically self-closes it, and it puts the cursor in the center. So that's handy. I could either start typing my rules right here, blah, 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 okay? Or I can hit the return key, and it automatically tabs to the right spot. This is what I'm going to do, since I'm going to have probably more than one declaration. Now, when we talk about CSS, we've got and this goes back to the lecture materials, we have our selector. So in CSS, this IMG, it's not called a tag, it is a tag selector, meaning that it's going to select the tag that is up in the HTML. It's going to find every instance of that IMG. All right, if there were multiple images, it would treat all IMG tags the exact same way. All right, so that's important to understand. And so here, let me zoom back out so we can see a little bit more of the screen here. All right, and let's also pull this up. Okay, so you can see it better. Now we've got this IMG selector, and then that means it's going to pick every instance of an IMG that's in the associated HTML. So let's start off first by telling it how wide to be. We're going to say width. This is a property name, okay? And then the property is followed by a colon. And then you're going to put the value of that property. It's very similar to how attributes and values are in HTML tags. Well, these are properties with values that are applied to the selectors. Okay, so in the width, let's just say right now it is its natural size. Let's say that I wanted to say it's 100%. All right, and then automatically what it does is it makes it 100% of whatever space is given. Now, if I wanted to tell it to be 50%, all right, it becomes smaller. Now, it might look really big. That's because I'm zoomed in. Let me zoom back out to my natural size, and you'll see what's going on here. All right, so if I say 50%, it goes to half the screen. If I say 100%, oops, that's 1,000. If I say 100%, it takes up 100%. But at least now it's not bigger than the actual screen anymore. All right, it's actually confining itself to 100% of its parent dimension. And if you're wondering, well, what is its parent dimension? That would be the body tag, because the IMG right now is just floating inside the body tag, because remember the pen is assumed that whatever you're typing in this HTML up here is inside the body tag. And the body itself, the body tag, is always going to be confined to the space, the height and the width of the actual browser viewport. What is a browser viewport? Let's look at this in a separate window. The viewport is going to be this whole space right here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump back over. Let's actually close that. Okay, and let's come back over here, and I'll go back to my change view and get back to my normal layout. All right, and so I want to change this. Let's say that we want it to be 50%. Okay. Okay, so now that that is 50%, this align left is allowed to actually kick in and work. This line left that's in the HTML. And so what align left does is it takes that picture and it pushes it to the left of the other material that comes after. There is something in CSS later that we're going to learn about that's similar to this, but it's different. It's called a float, but we're not talking about floats yet. Okay, so so now that we've got that image sort of squared away, one of the things that you might also want to go ahead and do is place the background image in here. And the reason you want to put the background image is because it's going to make a huge difference. If I were to start, modifying my text in the way it looked right now, and then later I went and I put my background image in, then I might have to redo a lot of work. If I know I'm using that background image, then I want to go ahead and put it in now and make sure that I can scale my text and add the right colors and things like that based on how it's actually going to look behind it, right? So that the text is actually in the environment that it's ultimately going to live inside later. Okay, so in order to do that, all right, there's some different ways that we can approach this. You need to find some kind of element that you would want to attach that background image to. All right, here's the tricky part about using CodePen right now, is that you have to understand right now that all of this HTML that's up here is inside the body tag. And the body tag doesn't actually, you don't see something that actually says body up here in the HTML, but you have to understand that it actually is being considered as part of the HTML. All right, and in case you want to see exactly what I'm talking about, you could go ahead down here and you could say export this pin, and let's just say export to zip, and I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about. So if we were to come over, excuse me, if we were to come back to our downloads, all right, and let's go and look at this thing that says pen 2, okay, and then I'm going to say open in Finder just so that I can go ahead and open this thing. All right, I'm going to say open with, and I'll just open it in TextEdit again since we haven't talked about something else yet. All right, and you'll see that in TextEdit, all of that stuff, remember, all of that stuff that we had before is in fact inside of a tag that's called body. All right. The other thing that you're going to notice is that, of course, everything is inside of this tag called HTML. Both the HTML tag and the body tag, just so you know, can accept properties. Okay, they can accept CSS. I could place a background image on the body. I could actually place a background image on anything. I could put it on this paragraph. I could put it also on an IMG, which would be weird, but I could place it on an article, a header, anything. But I can also place it on the HTML tag. And because ultimately the body is inside the HTML tag and the HTML is the entire document, so that is also technically going to be represented inside of the the browser window. All right, so I just want to show you that so that you understand that we can use body as a selector and we can use HTML as a selector. So I'm going to close this out again. Just close that. All right, and we're going to go back and start working in our code pen again. Forget the thing I just downloaded. That was just for illustration purposes. All right, now, so that means that what I want to do is, and I like to, by the way, I like to put my CSS sort of in the same linear order that you might run into things in your HTML. So in that case, HTML would actually be the very first tag that you would find, and then also you would find body after that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just create these empty spaces where we could start typing in rules for the HTML and for the body. So for right now, what I'd like to do is let's go ahead and put the background image on the HTML itself, so you can see what that looks like. To do that, I went ahead and I opened up this other window where I've placed something on a server in a web server that I have. It's called sandbox.leekottner.com/project-assets/mat125. All right, so if you go to that, then you would be able to get this directory listing that I have here. And this is where I'm going to be placing some assets that you can use for different assignments, like images that I want you to link to, so that you have the ability to use them in your pins. And this, you can also copy the link to the specific assets in your assignment details. Anyway, if I go into pen 2, because this is the one I'm working on, this is the landscape image that I want to use. If I click on that, you'll see that this is our landscape background. And so if I click on that picture and then I highlight the URL that's up here, I can right click and I can copy that. All right, and then I can jump back over here and I can use that as a part of my background image. So how do you write a background image? Well, let's just go ahead and start typing that. So on my HTML tag, I'm going to type background. I'm going to start to type the word back, right? And then it shows up with all these different options. So later I'm going to show you how to do shorthand with just the word background. But in the meantime, before I show you that, I want to show you what's referred to as longhand, where you write all of these properties out in long format. And the advantage of learning the long format first, I guess, is that you end up understanding the different specific pieces and parts that can later go into the shorthand format. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is find background image, all right, and then we'll have to put our little colon here. And the next part of the syntax is going to be URL, all right, and then if you start to type that, you get this option. You can hit return. And then the next part that you have to do is you have to put parentheses, not brackets or curly braces, but actual parentheses. And inside of the parentheses is where the name of that image is going to go. And so I'm going to just hit paste, and I used the Command V as in Victor on my keyboard, or on Windows it would be Control V. And so then you end up with this background image, all right? And it doesn't look exactly like our other example. That's okay. We'll get to how that is going to change in just a minute. And then you want to terminate it with the semicolon, right? If you don't terminate it, you might have a problem. Okay, so go ahead and you can add your background image. And then the next thing that you want to go ahead and do is you want to make sure that this background never repeats itself. Right now, it's a pretty big image for the size of my viewport area. But if you look over here, like this picture doesn't, well, actually, if I click on it like that, it does fill it up. It's a pretty big picture. So I don't think that we would ever have a problem with it not filling a screen, but just in case someone were to look at it on a gigantic monitor, you want to make sure that it doesn't repeat. So you would start to say background again, and then you can go down here and find where it says background repeat, okay? And then again, you're going to put the colon. And then there's some different options for background repeat. One is the word repeat. If I were to start to type the word repeat, then it would give me some options. It would tell me repeat, which means it will repeat both on the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis is the horizontal axis, the y-axis is the vertical axis. So as soon as the picture no longer was big enough for that space, then it would just repeat in either direction. Okay, if you only wanted it to repeat in one direction, then you could do repeat x, or you could do repeat y for vertical, or repeat X for horizontal. I don't want it to repeat at all, so I'm going to say no, and if I start to type the word no, you'll see some different options. I'm going to put no dash repeat, okay? So to make sure that that never repeats. The next property I want to talk about is background position. So I'm going to drop down to the next line, and if I start to type the BA, right, you can see that it comes up with my options. I'll scroll down to background position, or arrow down, and choose it. All right, and then I'll type my colon, and then now here's the way that background position works. So you have an x-axis and a y-axis, and you can either start by saying that you want it, for instance, to start from the left, and first it goes X, so the horizontal axis, and then the y-axis, top and bottom. So if you wanted it to start from the left, all right, it's going to start from the left edge first, and then let's say you wanted it to start from the top of the picture, you could type top like that, and it takes us right back to where we were, and that's that top left edge of the picture. Alternatively, you can also tell it in pixels or in percentages. So if I put 0 here, it would take it to the 0 left pixel. So starting from the very left edge, you know, it's just like we read in a book, you read from left to right. So it would be the 0 pixel position, and also the top 0 position, right? Now, the thing that I could also do is I could tell it that I wanted it to be like a percentage over. So let's just say that for the left position, we wanted it to be 10% over, right? And then you see that it moves it 10% in to the picture towards the right side. If we said 50%, let's try that. It basically puts us so that it is in the very center, all right? So that it centers the image, okay? If we were to do the same thing over here, 50% for the top, then it centers the picture completely, both vertically and horizontally. Another way that you could do that is you could just say 50%, and then it will be 50% for both X and Y values. Another way that you could do that is you could say the word center. All right, if you wanted something perfectly centered, all right? And if you said center, center, then it's the same as saying 50%, 50%, okay? So the other thing that you could do is if you wanted something to start from the right side of the picture, you could start by saying right, and then maybe also bottom, for instance. So you could have it start like that. Now, the thing that you need to also pay attention to is you know, how this picture is going to scale itself. We haven't gotten to that yet. So right now, let's just say that we want it to be center, and that's going to be centered in both directions. But the thing that, if you think about the way that it was originally, is that we always want the sky to be present. So I actually want it to be centered left and right, but then I want it to start from the top, okay? So that it always starts there from the top. So let's go ahead and terminate that, and let's just start with that. And you can mess around with that however you want, and to kind of play around and see what happens with it. The other thing now that we need to do is decide what happens if this thing scrolls. So the thing is that because there's not very much copy on here, and when I say copy, I'm talking about text, there's not very much stuff on here. So right now we're not in a position where this is so far ever going to scroll. But if it did, you would need to know what was going to happen with the background image. Is the background image going to scroll with the page, or is it going to stay in place? And so the way that you can call that is background attachment. All right, so the background attachment is whether or not the background picture is going to scroll. If you don't want it to, you can say fixed. If you want it to scroll, then you just leave it blank. You don't even have to do anything. The default behavior is to make it scroll. Okay, so fixed means that the content of the page will scroll, but the background image will not. Okay. There's one other thing too that you may have noticed earlier. Sort of a weird thing happened was that part of the picture had gotten cut off. And what you can also do is you can always make sure that it does a background cover. So it covers the entire page, and that's going to be background size. All right. And background size is oddly one of those ones that doesn't fit in shorthand. Later when we do shorthand, you still have to tell the background size separately from the shorthand of using just the background property. But so background size has some different options. It has contain, for instance. Oops, contain. And contain is the same as saying 100%, meaning that it goes 100% width of the screen. All right, but that's what contain is. You can also tell it to be a certain size horizontally and vertically. So we could maybe say 100%, 100%, but the problem then is it's going to stretch the picture, and it stretches it in a way that's really noticeable, and it distorts the image. Don't ever do that. Don't ever, ever, ever do that. Okay, that's just a bad design practice. But the other option that's a really common option now is this one called cover, background size cover. And what that will do is that it will scale the image, and it will still maintain its background position properties, and it will always make sure that it covers the entire page. And that's a really good option. The thing is, though, that some of the picture eventually will get cut off. So like if it's a horizontal picture and you do something where it's like vertically oriented like this, then it definitely will cut part of it off. It's just the nature of what will happen, because it's not distorting the picture. If it gets really, really wide, then it's going to start to cut some of it off vertically, you see. All right, but it's still one of the best options that we have, right, in order to get a full size covering background image.